Hello, everyone. My name is Yann, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm a PhD student at ETH Zürich. Our building is just across the road from here. This work I'm going to present today is joint work with Lioba, who is also here in the room today, Juan, who was working on this as part of his master thesis, Luciana, and our advisor is Roger Wattenhofer. First off, a little disclaimer. So everything I'm going to talk about today, so we found this vulnerability, right? And we disclosed it to the Ethereum Foundation, and we have we're allowed to talk about it now. And we also received a bug bounty for it. So let's jump in. Here I have a depiction of the Ethereum peer-to-peer network, which the whole blockchain is built up on. And so here you see what I display here are nodes, specifically consensus nodes. So these are the, for example, Lighthouse or Prism clients that you all know. And they're connected to each other, and they host validators. Validators are the entities that run actually the consensus. And as you see, there's not always a validator on every client or on every node. And some nodes have, of course, multiple validators. And the validators themselves, right, I said they have an ID. They, from time to time, some slides is missing, that's okay. They have to, every epoch, they have to send one attestation, and where they attest the current head of the chain. And then more rarely, they have to propose blocks, right? So I think for a single validator, maybe proposes a block every 3 to 4 months. But every 6 minutes, they have to send an attestation. And so how does that look like? Right? So if we have here validators, actually, in practice, if you look at it, you don't know where the validators are situated. And there's a good reason for this, right? So there's this anonymity property. And why do we want this anonymity, you might ask? Well, let's consider this simple example where there's these validators. And they create a blockchain. So now here, there's a block created by validator 7. Then there's a next block by validator 1, et cetera, et cetera. Validator 4 creates a block. Now, as you know, there's very often MEV on chain. And that means that certain blocks will have a much bigger reward than others, right? And so now validator 4 can see this MEV opportunity and can, if validator 4 is malicious, if he knows where validator 1 is, he can launch an attack on the client, on the node of validator 1, right? And so he can prevent this block from ever being proposed, and thus he can swoop in to get the rewards for himself, right? And that's obviously a pretty bad consequence if we don't have anonymity. There's more, though, so you can keep doing this. All right, so you could not only do it when there's a big reward, you could also keep doing it so that there's no more liveness in the system. And maybe even worse, if the attacker's a bit even more powerful, right? Maybe you could even impact safety by tricking, for example, light clients. You might be able to trick that there's 2 different states suddenly. So to look into the attack a little bit more, I have to dive a bit deeper into the Ethereum network layer. Maybe I can teach you something, because I think it's very interesting design here. And so how it works is if a validator wants to send an attestation, you could do this by simply broadcasting to everyone, right? And then everyone broadcasts again to everyone. This is called flooding. The problem with this is that Ethereum has 1 million validators, right? And that means 1 million messages every 6 minutes. That's a huge load. And so instead, what Ethereum did now, or like for the merge, is that they use Gossip Sub, which introduces this idea of subnets. So instead of everyone talks about everything, everyone only cares about 2 subnets, and there's 64. So every node that you see here only cares about 1 or 2 subnets. And that reduces the message complexity quite a bit. I'll show you how it reduces complexity. So assume now validator 1 wants to send an attestation. The attestation, maybe you noticed, the validators are grouped in committees, right? It doesn't really matter for this, but the validator knows in which committee it is, and hence it can know in which subnet that committee is assigned to. So it knows this attestation needs to go to subnet 5, right? And so what it can do, it can check, okay, which of my peers are in subnet 5, send that to these peers, and then only the peers inside the subnets will gossip this attestation to everyone inside that subnet, right? And so everyone in the subnet gossips, again, similar to before. But then what you can do is that there's only a few aggregators in that subnet that will take all these attestations, and they'll make a single one of them with multi-signatures. And then that aggregated signature you can then broadcast globally to everyone. So we were wondering, oh, this is a interesting design that was introduced. What could go wrong? What's this kind of the trade-off here, right? And specifically, what does it mean for anonymity and for privacy? I see that my animations are not working, sadly, but all good. So you cannot, in principle, you don't know who is connected to who. So what you see actually is just a bunch of clients, except if you run your own client, then you can see your peers, right? And you see the IP addresses, and you can connect to them. Now, you can also see in which subnet they are in. They advertise that to you, right? Because you need to know to whom to send what type of messages. And so you will also see the attestations that they send to you, right? And that's the other piece of information that you have. So now you might wonder, which of my peers is running what validator, right? And now I'm going a bit into what we did. So we're thinking now to have more information. Even we can claim that we're in all subnets, or we can actually be in all subnets, right? So we say, hey, I care about every subnet. I can forward you any message you want me to forward. And so what, in theory, we should observe is that every peer sends us essentially all their messages always, right? In practice, there's a little bit of details because of fan-outs and peer scores and stuff like this, but mostly, we observe this as well, mostly if we say we're in all subnets, then we do receive everything. So now let's have a concrete example. So we're here, we're connected to a peer here. They advertise that to us that they're in subnet 13 and 14. And then if we look at what we receive, you see, yeah, we receive a lot of attestations for subnet 13 and 14. But wait a second, we also receive some other things. That's maybe not expected. And then you can look a bit deeper, and you can see that they're all from the same validator, maybe, right? They're all from the same validator ID. Now, there's no reason that this peer knows about all these other messages, because he's not subscribed to these other subnets, right? So how could he know about these attestations? Well, the most likely explanation is that these attestations were created here, actually. They're created by that peer itself. So that's the whole kind of intuition behind our attack. By observing this, we can assign validators to clients. So more precisely, what do we do? So now we run a node, and we try to connect it to as many peers as possible. We listen to all the attestations that they send to us, right? We log all of the attestation here. And then we can analyze all this data and try to extract the anonymization. And I'll show you some real data here. So this is only one connection, as the example before. So you see here on the x-axis, there's the different subnets, the 64 subnets. Here there's a couple hours of us listening to attestations. And now let's look at from which validators have we received attestations here. So you see all the red dots, they come from a single validator. Then you can see there's a second one, blue dots, another, and a fourth. And they explain kind of almost all the points that are outside the subscriptions. The subscription here was 13 and 14, right, before. So all of these are kind of expected. They're what was subscribed. And all these that I colored are kind of the outliers that you wouldn't suspect, right, initially. So you see that this is a very clear picture, and even more so, you see that all the validators, they have IDs that they're just one off, right? So this is very common if you run, if you sign up to Ethereum at the same time, you get consecutive IDs. And then there's maybe one more thing I should explain here. is these other kind of, so in pink, by the way, I should say, these are all the other validators that we receive attestations from. And you might see that there's a couple pink here, right, that you might first not know what it's from. But actually, these patterns match pretty much exactly the aggregation duties that I just briefly talked about before. So if you have to aggregate, then for a brief moment of time, you need to subscribe to that subnet. And so this, for example, here, so that peer subscribed to the subnet was also propagating attestations for a bit, and then created the attestation, the aggregation here, which you see here, created the aggregation, and then unsubscribed. And that's exactly the pattern we also see in the data. Right, so here we would say, okay, we have de-anonymized these 4 validators on that peer, right? Now we're going to do this for much more. And to do it more kind of more precisely, right, we introduce a methodology. I'll briefly run you through. So we create a logging client. So we use Prism, and then we add all this, what I talked about, of capturing all the information we can. We call it Rainbow. Then we run our Rainbow client in 4 locations. There's 3 of them are AWS, and 1 of them is just in our office and our servers. And you see here, we have a Frankfurt location, a Seoul location, Virginia, and Zurich. And we see here that's how many peers they get. So Virginia has been pretty popular, and Zurich as well. The others, not so much. We can connect to a few less peers. I can talk about the details for this later if you want to. And then we kind of introduce heuristics to kind of extract the de-anonymization. And for our connection, you see here, we see about 11,000 peers in total, and for 4,000 we stay connected long enough. So these are the ones that now we want to try to de-anonymize. So we want to figure out in these 4,000 IPs what validators are running there. So these are our heuristics. I just put them there. We can discuss them, but it doesn't really matter so much. Instead, I want to jump right into the results. Maybe I should say just for the heuristics, right? We have run a study to kind of show which parameters make sense and which parameters are, and in the end, we chose the ones that are the most safe and the most conservative, right? So we don't want to have false positive at all. We were like very conservative with our parameters here. And so yeah, let's jump into the results. And let's start with Zurich. So this is kind of what have we observed from our Zurich machine that was bare bones server. So we had, in these 3 days, we had about 2,000 long connections. And from these 2,000 connections, for almost 60%, we can, with very high certainty, de-anonymize them fully. So we know exactly which validators run on these machines. For 30%, 34%, we know that there's no validators on them. Then there's 1% of the peers that are subscribed to all subnets. And so, at least not with this methodology, we cannot de-anonymize them for now. And then you see there's a 7% where our certainty is not high enough to de-anonymize. In numbers, this means that we have de-anonymized 160,000 validators. This was in May, so I think at the time it was about 1 million validators in total. So that was about 60% of all validators out there. And then we put a large focus on verifying these results, right? Because so far maybe you don't trust me. You saw some heuristics and you might not trust these results. This is why we have 3 ways of verifying these, right? And that's why I'm also quite confident that the de-anonymization is correct. First, we look at the consistency, what we call consistency of validators. So here is a bunch of data that you can look into for validators. So for example, you can see, so let's say, first of all, I should say, if we look at one client here, we look at, by consistency, how consistent are the validators inside that one client, right? And so we look, are these, all the validators that are assigned to this client, are they all from the same staking pool? Do they all have the same deposit address, right? Do they all use, when they propose blocks, do they use the same fee recipient address? And as we saw before, do they have consecutive IDs, right? So if one of these matches, we say that they're consistent. And then you might see, we look at the data of like, what is the consistency results. You see that our peers, they're actually quite consistent. If we look in terms of numbers of validators, there is a percentage that is not, fully consistent, or 40% of inconsistent. But, so we look at this, and at first glance, you might be worried now, you might not trust me anymore, but I will make you trust me again. So if you look at this matrix here, so this is all the, almost all the peers that have inconsistent validators, or the largest ones. And really, the inconsistents were mostly here. And you see a pretty interesting pattern that there's, especially these first 2 peers, they have a high overlap with the other 14 peers. So essentially, in other words, what it means is that these 3 peers pretend, or like they propagate the same messages as these 14. So in essence, or how to explain this, right, is that there are certain service providers that you can subscribe to as a validator, and you can send them your attestations, and these service providers will propagate that attestation better in the network, right? So you have like more resilience and maybe also lower latency for your attestations. Hence, why you won't want to subscribe to these service providers. So we have this evidence that there's these service providers, and thus we can kind of figure out who's a service provider, and we can remove them from the de-anonymization. So this 160,000 actually does not include all the inconsistent, or all the validators that were using service providers. So if we do this, we go from 250,000 to 260,000, the number I showed you before. And now we can use the second verification method. Namely, you can see whether a certain validator was mapped to multiple IPs. And this also, here we see quite many unique validators and little overlap. And the ones where there's overlap, it could also just be, they're often in the same location. And so it could be like rotation of IP addresses, for example, or there's multiple explanations for that. And finally, since we have 4 locations, right, we can make sure that all 4 locations de-anonymize in the same way. And here we get something like 95% of the same de-anonymization and 99% of the validators matching. That's it for verification. Now I think having de-anonymized this portion of the network, right, gives us quite a unique perspective into Ethereum decentralization as a whole, right? Because so far, people could only look at which clients are used, where are the clients situated, but no one could kind of look at where are the actual validators situated, where is the actual power located, right? So here, this gives us kind of a window, although it's a window because it's only 16%, but I think you can already see quite a few interesting things. For example, we can check how many validators are run on the peers, right? So on a single peer, how many validators entities run? And I think there's a few surprising things. So first of all, if you look at here, these are CDF plots. I'll just quickly go through them. So if you look at what this tells you, is that for about 50% of the peers, they run 4 validators or less. That's quite a large portion of kind of what we would call solo stakers, right? That don't have many validators on their client. Also quite interesting, you can see that at the round numbers, like there's 300, 400, 500, there's a little bump always. That's kind of, people like to run a round number of validators on their clients. You see this also here for the 5 largest staking pools. You see here the CDF is much flatter. It means there's much more validators that are run per peer if you run a staking pool. That's as expected. And you see here for 1,000 validators, there's prominent bump that staking pools like to run 1,000 validators per peer, apparently. And you see the same kind of bump at 500 and 300 here. A little interesting information as well. The most validators we saw on one peer was 19,000. That was very surprising to us, that from a single peer you could run this many validators. And also maybe thought-provoking is that we saw on the same clients validators from multiple staking pools, which if you want decentralization, right, you would want staking pools to be independent and not be run on the same machines. So that's also, a little bit, suboptimal. In terms of locations, you see here at the top where we find our peers that we connect to, right? There's not that many surprises here. There's a lot of peers in the United States and then in Germany and Europe in general. You see that there are 4 nodes here. And you can see that our node in the US is better at connecting to nodes in the US, as you'd expect, etc. And then in terms of de-anonymization, though, so in terms of where are the validators situated, you see there's a huge skew towards kind of Europe, and the United States somehow is not the top location anymore. So this was also kind of surprising to us, and I think one explanation is that our Zurich node was just so much better at connecting or at de-anonymizing peers in general. And one reason for this is that I think the hardware was better, and so we had lower latency because it was like a bare-bones server, as opposed to the AWS servers. So you see here, only in the US node was good at de-anonymizing validators in the US, but everywhere else, kind of our Zurich node was very good, was better at de-anonymizing. And then in Asia, though, you see the Korean node is also kind of okay at de-anonymizing in Korea and in the US, but still not great. So that's one thing. The other thing we can look at is the organizations that run validators. You also here see the usual suspects in terms of the peers that we connect to. So we connect to many Comcast, Hetzner, Amazon, etc. peers. There's also here a bias, and namely we see Amazon or AWS is not so prominent here. But if we look at de-anonymization, we de-anonymize a lot of validators on Amazon. And Hetzner here was very popular, but it's very unpopular in terms of validators. I think you could, we have some explanations for this, but maybe you have your own, or you have your own ideas why this could be the case. But I think interesting biases there. Now I also want to spend a little bit of time talking of what should we do now given this attack, and how can we prevent this attack from happening. There's a very simple way, but that comes with some costs, is if you want to only treat the symptoms, so the symptom being, for me, the biggest problem right away, short term, is if you want to propose a block and then you get, there's this denial of service attack that prevents you from proposing a block, right? If you want to just prevent this, what you could do is to run a second client separately that does nothing but proposing blocks, right? So this is kind of what already the bigger staking entities, I think, do, that they have not just one client, but they can run out of multiple clients. So adding a little bit more hardware might work in the short term, but I would argue in the long term is not really where we should go. A different option is to create private peering agreements. So maybe this client and this client, they trust each other. And so what they can do is that they can send each other attestations first. So they just share attestations among themselves first, and then they both broadcast it. And so what it means is that from the outside, it would look like there's multiple validators here and multiple validators here. And so from the outside, you get something like a notion of K-anonymity, right? It's harder now if you want to do a denial of service on validator 7, you'd have to both attack this node and this node. So that's potentially one option. Another option, also, again, targeting kind of the symptoms, is if we did secret leader election, because with secret leader election, you don't actually know in advance who is going to propose the next block. So that would also prevent attackers launching it in out of service. And more fundamentally, there are techniques to do anonymous broadcasting, right? Typically, though, they come at a large cost in terms of latency. And finally, and this is kind of also where I want to maybe open up to not just Ethereum and Gossip Sub, but other blockchain. How are other blockchain handling this? And we've seen quite a few blockchains now that go the exact opposite way of Ethereum, right? Ethereum has the goal of everything has to remain anonymous and prevent attacks like this. Other blockchains, they go the opposite way, where the IP addresses are actually put on chain, right? So it's every validator, everyone knows exactly where every validator is. The advantage of doing this, though, is that you can block traffic, or you can have like firewalls or like DOS prevention mechanism by blocking traffic from everyone that you know is not a validator, for example, right? So that way you can also kind of prevent denial of service, and certain blockchains are doing this. Yeah, that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. It's our paper.
Thank you very much, Yann. And now I think we have some time for questions. So, is there any question? Yeah? It's coming, the mic. Cube.
Yeah, sorry. So you managed to anonymize 16% of the validators on the network, but what happened with the rest 80% or so?
Yeah, so we just didn't, so we could run it for longer, right? And run out of more locations and have better servers that are better at de-anonymizing, right? And that way we could de-anonymize more. This was more like a proof of concept of, hey, this is possible. And even with 15%, right? If you propose many blocks, this allows you still to do this sniping attack, right? Where you can prevent snooping some MEV. But yeah, for now, this is a proof of concept, and we were not interested in de-anonymizing everyone.
I was wondering if those other validators had like some protection mechanism in place that prevented the attack.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think definitely. So there's one staking pool that we haven't de-anonymized at all. Like no validator from that staking pool. So maybe that staking pools, for example, is subscribed to all 64 subnets, which means that with this methodology, we cannot de-anonymize them. And there might be cases like this, yes. And all the ones that use this service providers that I mentioned, we also cannot de-anonymize, right? Yeah.
I think there is another there.
If people use MEV commit and all the proposer builder separation stuff, I think what happens is the validator will send their signature to the MEV people, and the MEV people will broadcast the block. How does that affect the methodology here?
Sorry, can you repeat? I missed the beginning.
If you sign a block that Flashbot builds for you, how does that affect the de-anonymization attacks?
If you sign a block that Flashbot. So you're saying as the proposing duties, if that kind of adds more information to the de-anonymization, or?
I mean, I guess the question is set backwards, because one of the attack goals is to find the proposer before they propose. But what happens if they outsource block building and they give the signature to
right. Yeah, but then I guess if you do that, you have trust assumptions to the person you give away your information, right? So yes, and I think we might see a talk later on that talks about this.
I think there was one last question here.
Yes.
Oh, this is a microphone. Are there any other peer-to-peer protocol changes that you recommend that might mitigate this?
Well, even Gossip Sub, right? So this is lit peer-to-peer, right? And this is only if you use Gossip Sub in this way of having multiple subnets, right? So we exploit the fact that the way these subnets are used, right?
So if you had a validator on a node with only a single validator, then this wouldn't work, right?
If you have only a single validator?
Yeah.
No, then it works even better. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But if you have only a single gossip topic, or if you have only a global gossip, which most blockchain also only have, right? Only a single, everyone talks about everything, then we cannot do this. Yeah. Thank you very much.
There is one question. I think we have 1 minute for one last question.
Will it be possible to implement or adjust the protocol on a protocol level? For example, if the peers would change the subnet every epoch or something like that, would that make this kind of attack basically update the protocol such that this type of de-anonymization is not possible anymore? Would something like that work?
Yeah, good question. I think it's inherently the information would still be there, and maybe it would take a bit longer to de-anonymize, right? But I don't see, apart from thinking really about anonymity and yeah, maybe this k-anonymity notion, right? So adding more message complexity back, this maybe, but just changing subnets more often, for example, I don't think that would help. To me, there's no obvious, simple answer to how to solve this, yeah. But maybe there is.
Okay, if there is no other question, I don't see any. We can thank again the speaker. Thanks, Yann.
Thank you very much.